You only stepped outside to clear your head. That's all it was meant to be. A breath, a pause. A few minutes away from the noise of the room behind you, where laughter echoed too loud and the air felt too full. You weren't trying to be mysterious, or make a memory, or find someone leaning against a brick wall with a lighter in his hand. You just needed cold air. You just needed to feel your own skin again. The night wrapped itself around you like a thin coat chill at the edges, but oddly. Welcome. You exhaled, and your breath fogged gently in front of you. A kind of small ritual you've done 100 times before. Cigarette in one hand, silence in the other, the city soft around you. Distant cars whispering by, your thoughts finally slowing to something that felt like stillness. And then him, you saw him before he saw you. Or maybe he saw you first but pretended not to. It doesn't matter now. What you remember is the way his lighter clicked open in that quiet way, like the pop of a vinyl record beginning to play, soft and intimate. You weren't close yet, but you could see the glow at the tip of his cigarette. The way his eyes followed the flame for a moment longer than necessary, like he was warming his thoughts on it. You moved closer without knowing why. There was space. There was stillness. There was something in the air that didn't feel quite ordinary, not charged, not romantic, just available. Like the moment had opened itself and you both stepped into it by accident. He looked up, said nothing at first, just raised his hand slightly, the flame still dancing. It took you a second to realize he was offering it to you. No words, no gesture, just a glance and a shared understanding. And for a moment, you hesitated, not because you didn't want it, but because something about the simplicity of it startled you. How long had it been since something was offered to you without a reason? You stepped forward and leaned in, cigarette between your lips, and he shielded the flame with his palm, steady, close. The briefest brush of fingers, maybe, or maybe you imagined it. The flame caught, and you inhaled, the tip glowing red gold, and for a second, both your faces were lit from beneath like campfire ghosts telling stories they weren't ready to. Say loud, "Thanks," you murmured, because silence had to be broken eventually, didn't it? But even that word felt too heavy, too formal for what had just passed between you. Something quieter, something older than language. He nodded, eyes calm, voice lower than you expected when he finally spoke. Cold night for thinking. You didn't answer right away. You didn't need to, because he wasn't asking. It was a comment meant to hang there gently, like the fog from your exhale. You let the smoke curl up between you both, the kind that doesn't hide anything, just softens the sharpness of the world. The two of you stood like that for a while, not speaking, not moving, just breathing in rhythm with the night. Strangers, but not strangers. The kind of moment where names would have felt too sudden, where introductions would have broken something sacred. You weren't meeting, you were noticing. And somehow that felt truer. He leaned back against the brick wall, and you found a nearby spot on the metal railing, arms folded, cigarette balanced between fingers, eyes watching the shimmer of streetlights reflected in tiny puddles. You weren't trying to be cool. He wasn't trying to impress you. There was no game in the air. Just presence. The wind tugged at your hair once, and he glanced sideways. Not the kind of look that tried to own anything, just a glance. A witness. The kind of look that says, I see that you exist here too, and somehow that felt like a kindness larger than a compliment. He didn't ask why you were outside. You didn't ask him either. It was understood. People step outside for all kinds of reasons: space, silence, secrets, sadness. The specifics don't matter when the energy feels the same. And in that moment, your energy matched. The smoke between you curled upward like it had something to say, and maybe it did. Maybe smoke is just the language of unsaid things leaving. The body. At some point, you asked if he wanted to sit, motioning to the old bench by the lamppost that looked like it hadn't been claimed in years. He shrugged once, easy, and followed. It wasn't a bold move. It wasn't flirtation. It was something simpler, an invitation to linger. You sat with a space between you, not too close, not too far, and you stared straight ahead. At nothing, at everything. The city felt quieter here. Like it had pressed pause just for the two of you. Time didn't stop, but it slowed enough to let you notice the way his shoes tapped lightly against the ground, the way his knuckles tensed when he flicked ash, the way he breathed like he was trying not to think too hard. And maybe that's when it happened, not the falling, not the moment hearts collide, but the recognition that you were both here not just to be alone, but to not be alone together. And that realization settled into your bones like warmth. He said something about how winter always made people more honest. That cold peeled back the layers people usually hid behind. You smiled but didn't reply. Not because you disagreed, but because you understood. It was the kind of truth that didn't need affirmation, just company, and that's what the moment became. Not romance, not mystery. Just company. The kind that says, you don't have to explain anything. I'll sit here anyway. You didn't check the time. You didn't pull out your phone. You didn't even feel the need to plan what came next. All you knew was that the flame he'd offered you still warmed something deeper than your fingers. Not a fire, not yet, but a flicker. The beginning of something neither of you were naming, when your cigarette burned low and the cold nipped harder. At your ankles, you stood slowly, brushing ash from your coat. He stood too, like it was the most natural thing in the world to follow your rhythm. Thanks, you said again, quieter this time, but not just about the lighter. He nodded again. Anytime. And strangely, you believed him, not in the way people promise future meetings, but in the way someone promises presence. If the night asked again, he'd answer. That's all. You walked back toward the door with the heavy thud of the city behind it, that just before you reached it, you turned slightly, and he was still there, just standing, not waiting, not watching, just there. A flame already gone, but a warmth somehow still lingering. And that's how it started. Not with fireworks, not with fate, but with a lighter offered in silence. And a moment that didn't ask to be more than what it was, real. You didn't go back. Inside right away. The door was only a few steps behind you, still vibrating faintly with music and distant laughter, like the party hadn't even noticed your absence. And maybe that's why you hesitated at the threshold, because something about being out here, in the quiet air with someone who asked nothing of you, felt more real than the world you just stepped out of. No noise, no introductions. Just the sharp, clean night and a stranger who hadn't tried to fill the silence. He was still standing a few feet from the bench when you looked back, not scrolling his phone, not fidgeting, just present, as if the moment didn't need to be entertained to be enough. You found yourself drifting back to him, not consciously, not with intent, but with that soft pull your body feels when something in the air is kind. Not demanding, not intoxicating. Just kind. Do you mind if I stay out here a little longer? You asked, voice gentler than you expected. He shook his head once, easy. Not at all. And that was it. The conversation didn't leap forward. From there, it stretched slowly like a cat in warm sun. You both returned to the bench, and the space between you returned too. Familiar now, like a soft thread stretched between your shoulders that didn't need to be pulled taut to be felt. Smoke curled between you, rising in loose spirals that danced and disappeared before either of you could follow them. You noticed vaguely how the glow of the street lamp flickered slightly, just enough to give the night a pulsing texture, as if it too was breathing in time with you. You didn't say much, neither did he, but the silence didn't press against you the way it sometimes does. It wasn't awkward. It wasn't charged. It was the kind of silence that exists between people who have no interest in performing. And maybe that's why it felt so holy. Because in a world where everyone seems desperate to be seen, here you both were being felt instead. When he finally spoke, it was with a voice that stayed low, like he didn't want to wake the street. You from here? You nodded. Sort of, long enough to be tired of it, but not long enough to leave. He smiled without looking at you. The kind of smile that understands. The kind that doesn't need to turn into conversation. And then the silence came back again, like an old friend curling up at your feet. You took another slow drag, not because you needed the cigarette, but because it gave your hand something to do. Something to hold while your mind wandered gently into the shared quiet. I come here sometimes, he said after a while. This street, this bench. It's the kind of place no one looks for stories in. You glance at him sideways. And yet here we are. His grin widened a little, but he didn't laugh. Just flicked ash toward the curb watching it fall like a firefly that lost its way. You liked the way he spoke, not just the sound of his voice, which was warm and steady and a little rough, like he carried gravel in his throat, but the way his words didn't try to crowd the air. He left room for you, for the moment, for the possibility that the night might be enough without anyone trying to shape it. Most people rush to fill the quiet. They speak to feel real. But he didn't. And in return, you didn't have to either dot, so you sat, you smoked. You listened to the gentle hum of nothing. And something inside you began to soften. You hadn't planned to feel safe. You hadn't planned to stay. But somehow your body recognized something your mind hadn't caught up to yet, that this stranger didn't want anything from you. Not even your story. He just wanted to sit near it. He asked your name eventually, but only after the second cigarette. Only after the silence had wrapped itself fully around you both, like an unspoken truce. You told him, just your first name, and he offered his in return, like a gift handed over with both palms. You didn't shake hands. You didn't move closer. The names hung there like soft coats on a hook, comfortable, necessary, but not too heavy. He asked, what had driven you outside? Not rudely, not as interrogation. Just curiosity, shaped gently like a question that would be perfectly okay unanswered. You shrugged, exhaling slowly. Just needed air. He nodded. Same. That was the whole exchange, but it felt like pages. You thought maybe about how rare this kind of silence is. The kind where nothing is hidden, and yet nothing is forced into the light. The kind where two people can just be, without narration, without performance. And as the minutes passed, you began to feel more yourself, as if pieces of you that had been scattered by the noise of the week, by the expectations of people, by the masks you wear just to move through the world, had slowly floated back, drawn by the magnetism of being unobserved in exactly the right way. It felt a little like magic. Not the sparkly, sudden kind. The quiet kind. The kind that doesn't shout to be noticed. The kind that lives in the pause between words. In the inch of space between shoulders on a bench. When he reached for his last cigarette, he offered you one without asking. If you wanted it, he just extended the pack slightly. Not presumptively, just habit. And you took it. Not because you needed it, but because it felt like a continuation of the conversation you weren't quite having in words. You both leaned back, smoke curling upward again like thoughts neither of you wanted to say aloud. Ever wonder how many moments like this you've missed? He asked suddenly. All the people you never noticed just because your head was somewhere else. You didn't have to think about it. All the time. He looked at you then, not dramatically, not with intent, but with the kind of gaze that holds for just a second longer than normal. Like he was giving you a full breath of his attention, and it didn't feel like pressure. It felt like peace. You looked away first, not because it scared you, but because it didn't. And somehow that felt even more dangerous. Your cigarette burned halfway down, and the air cooled just a little more, but neither of you shivered. You were warm somehow, not from the flame, from the moment. And maybe that's when you knew you wouldn't forget him, not because of what he said, not because of what he did, but because of how easy it was to be quiet next to him. Smoke still floated between you, silence still rested around you, and you weren't ready to go back inside just yet. Not now, not when you'd finally remembered what your own breath sounded like. Asterisk, the bench didn't belong to you, or to him, or maybe to anyone at all. But tonight it became yours the way certain moments do, quietly, without permission. You hadn't meant to stay long, but you were still there, legs stretched slightly in front of you, cigarette now just ash between your fingers, body leaning just enough to feel anchored. It wasn't comfort in the traditional sense. This was. No plush chair, no warm fireplace glow, but it was the kind of ease that crept in sideways. The kind that came from not needing to move, from not needing to explain. He was beside you, not touching, not talking much, just existing in a way that didn't disturb the quiet, and the quiet in return stayed. It wrapped around the both of you like fog, not thick enough to hide in, but soft enough to make the world feel distant. The music from inside the building had dulled to a vague thump, like someone else's heartbeat. You no longer had to listen to. Out here, time was slower, softer. Out here, everything was allowed to be unhurried. He shifted slightly, leaned forward to rest his elbows on his knees, head bowed, watching the glow of his cigarette tip as if it might offer some kind of answer. You mirrored him without realizing it. Two shapes folded into the rhythm of a night neither of you had planned to belong to. You weren't thinking about what came next. That was the strange magic of this hour. It suspended forward motion. The usual mental machinery, the calendars and clocks and endless inner narrations had quieted. You weren't imagining if he'd call, or if you'd remember his last name, or whether this would stretch beyond tonight. You weren't assigning labels to what was forming between you, because it hadn't asked to be defined. It had only asked to be felt. I think this bench has seen more honesty than most rooms, he said after a while, his voice slow and low, like he didn't want to startle the night. You glanced over, lips curving. It doesn't ask for much, does it? Exactly. You let the last bit of smoke escape with a sigh. Doesn't expect you to be funny or interesting or even okay. You nodded, letting your eyes return to the quiet street in front of you. The lamplight flickered again, then steadied. A breeze brushed past your ankles. You let it all move through you without resistance. Most people, you thought, want you to be a shape they can name. They ask questions with answers already in. Mind, where are you from? What do you do? Are you seeing anyone? But this bench, this hour, this stranger beside you, they weren't interested in that. They asked nothing. And in that not asking, they made room. I like that you're not trying, you said softly, to impress, to fill space. He turned slightly toward you, surprised maybe. Neither are you. The mutual recognition landed gently between you like an offering. You met his gaze then fully this time, and something in the way he looked at you made your heart slow, not flutter, not race, just slow, as if it too was listening. You didn't look away, you didn't need to, and neither did he. Eventually, you both turned forward again. The connection didn't break, it just resettled. A kind of shared stillness that pulsed gently between your shoulders. You wondered briefly if you should feel nervous or giddy or swept up, but you didn't. You felt okay. In a way that felt rarer than passion. You let your head fall back against the bench for a moment and stared up at the thin slice of sky visible between two buildings. A few stars managed to peek through the urban haze. Not many, but enough. It struck you how similar this was to connection, how sometimes even the faintest glimmers in the dark are enough to make you feel seen. He lit another cigarette, but didn't offer you one this time, and you appreciated that. The grace of not repeating rituals unnecessarily, of letting moments be what they were, not what they've been. You always come out here alone? You asked eventually. He nodded. When I need to remember I exist outside other people's expectations. You felt that deep in your ribs. You let the words linger. I think I forgot what that feels like, you said after a beat. Just being, without adjusting myself. He looked over again, slower this time. You're not adjusting now. You blinked once, then smiled faintly. Maybe that's why I don't want to leave yet. And it was true. You weren't posturing. You weren't filtering your words through the usual lens of how they might be received. You weren't reaching for a clever line or shrinking from vulnerability. You were just here, on a bench that asked nothing, beside a man who didn't either. You shifted slightly, just enough that your shoulder brushed his for a moment, accidental or maybe not. He didn't flinch, didn't move away, just stayed present, real. The sound of a distant siren passed through the night, then faded. Somewhere down the street, someone laughed too loudly, and then the world was quiet again. You inhaled deeply, not smoke this time, just air, and you felt it settle in your chest. Like something solid. You realized then that you didn't want to kiss him. Not yet. Not because you weren't. Drawn to him, you were. But because the moment hadn't asked for anything physical yet, it was enough to be this close, to be understood this quietly, to feel the space between you filled with something wordless and calm, that kind of restraint, that kind of slowness. It felt almost holy. He spoke again, softer now. Funny, isn't it? How strangers can sometimes feel more like home than people we've known for years. You turn toward him slowly, maybe because they meet the version of us we've been keeping hidden. His eyes flickered, not wide, not startled, just knowing. Yeah, he said, exactly that. And the silence returned again. Not awkward, not empty, just there. A blanket draped loosely across the backs of your thoughts. You thought then that if you had to fall in love all over again with someone, with the world, with yourself, you'd want it to start like this. Not in fireworks, not in declarations, but in a long, quiet pause on a forgotten bench with someone who listened without needing to fix anything. You didn't know how long you stayed like that. You didn't count the minutes. They stopped mattering. Somewhere in the middle of your second conversation and your shared third silence. But when he finally said, "You want to walk for a bit?" You didn't hesitate. You stood slowly, both of you brushing ash from your coats, from your knees, from the fabric that had held the weight of something quietly important. And as you stepped away from the bench, you felt something like gratitude settle in your spine, not because of what had happened, but because of what hadn't. Because in a world full of rushing, improving, and performing, you'd found a place and a person who'd let you just be. And sometimes that's where love begins, not in a touch, not in a kiss, but in a silence that doesn't need filling, on a bench that asks no questions and in return gave you the answer you didn't know you needed. You don't know whose feet started first, yours or his, but when you rose from the bench and your legs began to carry you down the quiet stretch of sidewalk, it felt like he had always been beside you, not following, not leading, just walking beside you with the kind of rhythm that matched your own without trying. The space between you was neither deliberate nor calculated. It just was. Enough for air to move, for elbows to sway without grazing, but close enough that if you tilted your head, you could feel him there. Not just see him, not just hear his steps, but feel him. Some people walk near you like they're afraid to collide. Others walk like they want to be noticed. He walked like he'd been beside you before, in some forgotten chapter of another life. The city was asleep in that particular way it only is. Past midnight, not dead quiet, not eerie, just hushed. Like it knew to lower its voice and dim its lights to let the human world rest. Streetlights hummed gently overhead. Storefronts cast lazy reflections on the slick sidewalk. The wind had calmed a little, and though you could still see your breath with every exhale, something about the air felt less cold. You passed a newsstand locked shut for the night, a flickering neon sign above an empty noodle shop, and a tiny mural of a whale painted low near the curb that someone must have done long ago. You pointed it out without words, just a slight gesture with your hand, and he looked and he smiled, and nothing more was needed. You like that, how everything between you could be offered without explanation. The silence wasn't absence anymore. It had become your shared language. Funny, he said, finally breaking the quiet. How warm a night can feel even when the wind bites. You glanced at him, letting a small smile tug at the corners of your mouth. I was just thinking that same thing, and it was true. The chill was still in the air, brushing your ankles, curling at your ears, but it no longer had teeth. It had softened. Not gone, not forgotten, but dulled. The kind of cold you could live inside because something else was glowing deeper than your skin. You walk like that for a long time. No destination, no plan. Just movement, just quiet. Every so often, you'd stop at a traffic light even. Though there were no cars, or near the edge of a building where shadows were thicker and linger. Not because there was something to see, but because something between you asked to be still again. And every time when you stopped, he stopped too. No questions, no why. Just presence dot at one point, your hand brushed his, not on purpose. Not dramatic, just that accidental graze when two people forget to be separate. You could have pulled away, could have apologized or made a joke to cut the moment, but you didn't. You let it linger. Let your fingertips stay near his, not quite interlaced, not yet seeking, just there. Just enough dot he noticed. You could feel it in the way his steps slowed, but he didn't grab or claim or even shift closer. He simply let the closeness breathe. There's a kind of intimacy in that dot, the kind that doesn't need proof or permission. The kind that knows some fires burn brighter when left alone. You stopped again, near a low iron fence wrapped around a little public garden that was mostly dormant, now bare branches. Crumbling leaves, the ghost of flowers that once bloomed in summer. You leaned on the railing, hands tucked into your coat sleeves, eyes tracing the faint shapes of petals clinging to memory. He stood beside you quietly and lit another cigarette. You didn't want one this time. You just watched the glow as it flared against his face, outlining the edge of his cheekbone, his lip, the soft crease between his brow. He exhaled, and the smoke curled upward again, but this time it didn't feel like a veil. It felt like incense, like something sacred marking the space between you. I like how this night feels, you said after a long while, surprised at how certain the words sounded leaving your mouth. He looked over. Me too. No overthinking, no analysis. Just agreement, just truth. You sighed not with sadness, but with release. With that deep, exhaling relief of being seen without effort. And maybe that's when it really hit you. Not in a flash. Not with a dramatic heartbeat dot, but in that warm, stretching kind of way a sunrise hits your skin. The feeling that somehow this stranger beside you had become less of a question and more of an answer. Not to something you were asking aloud, but to something your soul had been whispering for a while. Let me feel something gentle. Let me remember what it's like to be held without being cornered. Dot. You looked down at the ground where the last of your cigarette's ashes still rested like a tiny trail behind you. And then you looked up at him, at the smoke rising, at the hush in his breath, Ashes fall, you said, almost to yourself, but the air still feels warmer. He smiled, not wide, not loud, just soft, just enough. Maybe warmth doesn't always need a flame. You didn't say anything back. You just nodded, and in that moment, something between you both shifted, not in a way that needed to be named, but in a way that asked to be honored. You began walking again, slower this time, feet light, heart softer, not floating, not racing, just soft. You passed another closed cafe, a row of quiet bikes chained in a crook line, a puddle reflecting the sky like a forgotten mirror, and still no destination, just motion, just companionship. At some point, he reached for your hand. No big moment, no dramatic pause, just a hand extended, palm up, open. You looked at it for half a second before slipping yours into his dotted fit. That was all. No spark, no lightning, just fit. And when he gently squeezed once, you let your fingers answer. The streetlights flickered again. A breeze passed. A leaf skated past your shoes. And so everything felt warmer. You didn't need to ask what this was becoming. You didn't need him to define it. Sometimes you don't need the fire, just the warmth it leaves behind when the ashes fall quiet. And sometimes it turns out that's more than enough. You weren't keeping track of the time. The hours had thinned into something loose and fluid, like warm wax melting down the side of a candle, still glowing, still alive, but no longer shaped like anything predictable. The city had gone quiet, enough that even your footsteps felt loud now, soft solace brushing pavement. Two shadows moving through a world that had forgotten to interrupt you. And you liked that. You liked that the world had paused. Not because of something big, but because it recognized something small. Something delicate between two people not trying to claim anything from each other. You turned the last corner without really knowing where you were headed. Your body led, not your plans, but your body felt safe here. Trusted the nearness beside you. Trusted the silence. And when you looked up and saw your building, standing there under a pool of yellow streetlight like a final breath before a goodbye, you felt something stir, not panic. Not longing, just something. A recognition that whatever this was, it had been rare, and you weren't quite ready for it to dissolve. You stopped just short of the door. The kind of pause that holds more than words. He didn't speak either. Just stood beside you again, hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. His shoulder a quiet presence against the chilled night. This was the part where most people ask, so, do you want me to come up? Or should I call you sometime? But he didn't. He just waited. Not for your invitation. Not for your decision. But for whatever came next to reveal itself naturally. And something about that made your breath slow, made your body lean just slightly in his direction. You looked at him in the glow of the streetlight, and it struck you again how he wasn't trying to impress you, wasn't performing, just was. A man who had shared the cold with you, shared his silence, shared his lighter and a long walk, and a kind of listening that most people don't even realize is a gift. And now, in the stillness outside your building, he stood there not asking to stay, but not leaving either. You turned your key in the lock and opened the door. You looked back once over your shoulder and your eyes met his. You didn't ask the question aloud, but somehow he understood the one that had bloomed quietly between your ribs. And he stepped inside after you. No rush, no hunger, just presence. You didn't kiss him in the hallway. You didn't reach for him right away. You just walked up the narrow staircase, past the flickering wall sconce that always buzzed faintly, past the slightly crooked painting of a ship lost in a blue-gray sea. You wondered if he noticed, if he felt the same reverence for the smallness of the moment, but you didn't ask. Some things don't need confirmation. Inside your apartment, the light was dim. A single lamp near the window, soft and amber. Your coat hit the hook by the door. His didn't. He kept it on, just for a moment longer, like he was still deciding where he belonged in your space. You crossed to the window and opened it just an inch, letting in a sliver of the night that had held you both so carefully. The air whispered in. You turned around and saw him still near the door, looking at you the way someone might look at a painting they don't understand yet, but don't want to walk away from. You offered a quiet smile and motioned toward the couch. He nodded once and sat, still not speaking, still letting the room breathe first. You moved to the kitchen, made tea without asking if you wanted any. You just made 2 cups, set them on the table between you. The warmth rose in spirals against steam. This time, not smoke, but it felt familiar. Felt right. He leaned forward, fingers tracing the rim of the mug. Thank you. For what? For letting the night keep going. You nodded, but didn't speak. You just sat beside him, not pressed close, but not far either. Your thigh near his, your breath matching again. You sipped the tea. He did too. And then finally his coat came off. It was a small gesture, one that carried no expectation. But it told you something. I'm not rushing. I'm not assuming. I'm just here until I'm not. There's something beautiful in the way. Some people take their time. You leaned back against the cushions and stared at the ceiling for a moment. It was plain, a little cracked in one corner. But tonight it felt like a sky you were both under. A sky that hadn't asked for anything in return. I don't usually do this. You said, not meaning to. He looked over kind. Me neither. There it was again, that truth you weren't trying to perform. Just share. You turned to him slowly. He was closer now, but still not touching. Still not assuming. You don't have to stay, you said, though your voice was quieter than your heartbeat. I know, he answered. That's why I want to. Your hand found his then, not out of need, but out of gravity. Something between, You had shifted its weight. He held your hand like it mattered, like it wasn't a placeholder for anything else. Just your hand, just your warmth. You didn't rush into him. You didn't fall all at once. You leaned, slowly, gently, and when his lips found yours, they didn't claim. They listened that the kiss was soft, not the kind that tries to write a story. The kind that reads one already written, and when it deepened, it did so like a tide not crashing, but pulling. Steady, certain, warm, you moved together without hurry. Clothes falling not like fireworks, but like petals. Fingers learning not just skin, but softness. Not just curves, but comfort. And when you finally found each other fully, deeply, it wasn't because you were trying to escape the world. It was because you'd finally found someone who didn't ask you to. You didn't talk much afterward. You didn't explain. You just curled near him on the couch, blanket half wrapped, limbs gently entangled, like your bodies already knew how to rest beside each other. And the silence returned, faithful as ever. He didn't ask if he should leave, and you didn't ask him to stay. But when you woke hours later, light just beginning to edge through the window, he was still there, eyes closed, breathing slow, still there. Asterisk, you woke slowly, not to an alarm, not to noise, just to warmth, to the quiet thrum of a heartbeat not your own, near enough that your body adjusted before your thoughts did. Your lashes fluttered, but you didn't open your eyes right away. There was something sacred about the way the morning light held the room soft and golden and slow to stretch. The windows hadn't opened yet. The world hadn't entered. You were still wrapped in something untouched. And he was still there. Your legs were tangled loosely with his. One arm rested beneath the curve of your waist, not tight, not possessive, just there. The way a hand holds a book after it's finished reading, reluctant to put it down. You didn't know when sleep had come. Somewhere between his fingers tracing the edge of your spine and the soft hush of breath beside your temple, the night had closed him like a sigh. And now, here you were, still inside it, you breathed in, slow and quiet. His scent lingered in the fold of the blanket tobacco and something clean, like cedar or cotton, and it filled your chest before memory caught up. You stayed still for a little longer, not because you were hiding from the moment, but because you didn't want to disturb the stillness that had become your shelter. Then, just as your mind began to rearrange itself around the facts, there's a man in my bed. He stayed. He didn't vanish with the dark. His voice came that low, rough, still half dreaming. You awake? You didn't answer immediately, just nodded slightly where your head rested near his collarbone. You felt his chest rise with a soft inhale. I was worried, he said quietly, that if I spoke, you'd disappear. You opened your eyes slowly. The room wasn't bright yet, but morning had threaded itself across the floor like pale silk. You lifted your chin just slightly to look at him. I'm not a dream. You murmured. I wasn't sure. he replied, smiling gently. You move like one that should have made you blush. Should have made you turn away or laugh or deflect. But it didn't. It just settled around you like warm water. Not praise, not performance, just noticing. And it made you feel seen. You sat up slowly, letting the blanket fall away from your shoulder, brushing the sleep from your skin with your fingers. He watched you, but not in a way that demanded anything. His gaze was still quiet, like watching someone light a candle in a church. The weight of the night still clung to your limbs in the best way, not heavy, not tired, just full. Like your body had remembered something it had long forgotten, what it meant to be safe in softness. You stood and stretched without speaking, wandered to the kitchen barefoot, the floor cool under your heels. He didn't follow. He just waited, still curled in the blanket, head resting against the back of the couch like this morning wasn't borrowed, but entirely his. You made coffee, not because it was expected, but because it felt natural, familiar. You moved around the quiet apartment with a sense of rhythm you hadn't felt in a long time, every movement gentle, every sound softened. When you returned, he was still there, arms now tucked behind his head, blanket pulled halfway down to his stomach, his chest bare, the slow rise and fall of his breath syncing with yours as you sat beside him again. You handed him a mug. He took it with both hands, like a gift. Neither of you spoke for a long while. You just sipped out and existed and let morning unfurl. Finally, he set his cup down on the table, leaned back into the cushions again, and tilted his head slightly toward you. Last night felt like something that doesn't happen anymore, he said. You nodded. It did. He didn't press, didn't try to define it, just acknowledged it, let it settle. You turned your face toward the window. The city was waking now slowly. A bus passed below, its brakes hissing. A bird perched briefly on the ledge before fluttering away. Somewhere, a dog barked once and then fell quiet again. Your chest was full, not with confusion, not with fear, but with a kind of recognition that didn't need words. He was still here, not by obligation, not because he didn't know how to leave, but because something inside him had chosen not to. I thought I'd feel strange in the morning, you admitted. I usually do. And now? You looked at him, let your gaze rest unhurried. I feel like I can breathe. He smiled. Not the kind people give when they're proud, but the kind they give when they're grateful. You wanted to ask him something, anything, that you didn't want to break the spell. So instead, you leaned back, let your head fall onto his shoulder, your body curled just slightly toward the warmth of his. And he didn't flinch, he didn't shift. He just let you rest there, as if he'd been waiting for a dot. His voice came again softer, now barely above a whisper. I don't know what happens next, he said, but I don't want to rush out of this. Neither did you, Dot, so you didn't. You stayed dot still dot soft dot and completely unready for anything else. Asterisk the sunlight was a slow visitor. It crept in sideways through your kitchen window, dancing across the surface of your coffee mugs and kissing the edges of his eyelashes while he dozed again against your shoulder. Time hadn't resumed yet. It was hovering somewhere above the room, quiet and merciful. You could hear the city waking outside, horns, footsteps, a siren that faded quickly, but it hadn't reached your apartment, not truly. Inside there was only warmth, steam, his breathing. You shifted just slightly, careful not to disturb the blanket still half wrapped around your legs, or the way your thigh leaned into his. He was still shirtless, and you traced his collarbone with your eyes, not your fingers, memorizing the slope of it like it might slip away if you looked too quickly. He wasn't asleep anymore, not fully, but he didn't open his eyes either. He stayed in that quiet place between dreaming and knowing, and you stayed with him. No one had spoken in half an hour. There hadn't been a need. Your last words, if they could be called that, had been a breathy laugh from him and a soft hum from you. Something shared about how the blanket smelled like old laundry detergent and smoke. But since then, just stillness. You should have been thinking about what came next, but your mind hadn't caught up yet. You weren't mapping out the next steps or deciding how to navigate his leaving. You weren't crafting exit lines or guarding your heart with disclaimers. All of that felt like it belonged to a version of you that hadn't met this moment. And this moment, this space, this stillness felt like a reprieve. He eventually moved, just slightly, just enough to tuck a strand of your hair behind your ear. His fingers brushed your cheek with the kind of care that usually comes too late. In relationships, the kind earned only after years. That here it arrived unannounced, and you let it land. I didn't mean to stay this long, he said softly, almost with a trace of apology. You smiled without turning. I didn't mean to. Want you to. You didn't look at each other when you said it. It was easier that way. Not because the truth was too big, but because it was so gentle it might vanish if held too tightly. And still, neither of you moved to leave. There was no decision, no pact, just an agreement written in body heat and breath, in the way your fingers had found his beneath the blanket and laced there without effort. He hadn't brought a charger. He hadn't brought a change of clothes. He wasn't supposed to be here still, but here he was, bare-chested, half asleep, and warmer than anything outside your door. You eventually stood, barefoot again, padding, to the stove with the lazy steps of someone who hadn't had to think about armor yet. You boiled more water. He followed, slower, quieter. Watched you in the same way he had the night before, like he didn't want to disturb the atmosphere, only to witness it. I can make eggs, you offered, voice half laughing because the suggestion felt absurd and domestic and too normal for the softness in your chest. He leaned against the counter and tilted his head. Only if we don't pretend this means something it doesn't. You stopped, glanced at him. Or pretend. It doesn't mean something, it does, you added. He nodded, and a grin slid across his face, not smug, not charming, just content. Like two people who had, for once, found the exact same page in a book they hadn't even meant to start reading. The eggs burned slightly because neither of you remembered to watch the pan. He leaned down to nudge your hip with his when the smell turned, and you both broke into the kind of laughter that doesn't require explanation. You scraped the edges off the pan together, standing too close, the sides of your arms touching in that casual, forgetful way that happens only when people no longer feel like strangers. He cleaned the plate after, washed it without being asked. Your tiny kitchen filled with water and clinking and steam again. You leaned against the door frame and watched him like someone might watch the tide steady, unhurried, doing exactly what it was meant to. When he was done, he dried his hands on the towel near the sink and turned, lips parted slightly, like he was about to speak. But he didn't. He just walked to you slow, stopped when his chest was inches from yours. You could feel his warmth. You could feel your breath shift. He didn't kiss you, not right away. Just looked at you, his hand lifted and hovered near your cheek, not touching, just waiting. And when you nodded, he touched you, not to claim, not to press. Just to be sure you were still real. The kiss that followed wasn't a repeat of last night. It wasn't charged or questioning or curious. It was quieter, sadder, maybe. Because it knew it might be the last, or maybe not. But it held that kind of weight. The way fingers might linger too long on the last note of a song. And when you pulled apart, neither of you stepped back. You stood like that for a while, breathing each other in, saying goodbye without saying it. But the door stayed closed, and time didn't tap its watch. And the morning, kind as it was, didn't ask you to rush. So you sat back on the couch, shared the last sips of coffee, watched the clouds move past your window like slow ships. He stretched out, arms behind his, head, bare stomach rising with each breath, and you curled beside him, head resting lightly on his shoulder again, like you had never moved. Like the night had simply grown longer than usual and let you stay. No one said goodbye. No one said see you soon. But when he finally stood, when he finally pulled his coat back onto his shoulders and opened the door with one last soft smile, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a bookmark. Not closed, just paused. And maybe. You thought as the door clicked gently behind him. That's how the best stories begin, not with a TUND not with a chase, but with a night. You didn't mean to stretch this long. And a goodbye you forgot to say asterisk. You told yourself you weren't expecting anything. Not a message, not a call, not even a pause in your day where his name might echo. But you also didn't put your phone on silent. You didn't flip it face down on the table. Instead, it sat there, bright screen blinking now and then with ordinary things, group chats, A calendar reminder, a weather app alerting you that clouds were coming. And still somewhere in the quiet edge of your mind, a thought drifted soft. As smoke, what if it buzzes again and it's him? The day after he left had passed in the strange blur that follows a dream too vivid. You'd moved through it with quiet limbs and a hush around your shoulders, brushing your teeth slower than usual, reheating coffee that tasted too flat, opening your closet and closing it again without taking anything out. The city outside kept moving, stubborn and unromantic, but inside you, the night still echoed. You hadn't cried. It hadn't been that kind of departure, but you had looked at your couch longer than you meant to, had stood near the door with your hand on the knob. For a few seconds too many, not hoping, just remembering. The way a body remembers, warmth long after the blanket is folded away. And when you finally lay back in bed, that night sheet's cooler, the window still open a crack, you turned your face into the pillow and whispered nothing. Just breathed. Let the quiet wrap around you like the echo of something tender. You told yourself it had been one night, that this is what some moments are made for, and you believed it, mostly. But the next afternoon, while you sat curled up with your knees beneath you, a book open in your lap, but not turning its pages. Your phone vibrated once. You didn't leap, didn't lunge, just glanced. And there it was, his name, no heart emoji. No. Flood of messages, just 4 words. Still thinking about you. You stared at the screen longer than you should have, like the message itself might do more if given time. It didn't. It just sat there, steady, unapologetic, unrushed. You reread. It dot once, dot twice, dot. A smile tugged at your lips, not the giddy kind, but the quiet kind. The kind that arrives in the middle of a sigh, still thinking about you. He hadn't said, I miss you. He hadn't said, let's do this again. He'd just opened a door, one crack wide enough for breath. And the most surprising part was how easily your fingers moved to reply. Me too, quietly, but yes. You set the phone down then, deliberately, pulled the blanket tighter around your shoulders and let the silence resume, but now it felt different. It felt like a conversation left open instead of closed. The buzz returned an hour later. I kept seeing little things today that reminded me of you. You asked what things. He answered simply. The way someone stirred their coffee like they were thinking too hard. A girl wearing a navy scarf like yours at the crosswalk. A record store. I almost walked in. You smiled again. This time out loud. The night hadn't ended. It had just changed shape. By the third message, he was telling you about the podcast he'd been listening to that morning. Something about old buildings and the way certain windows were designed to catch moonlight. You answered with a photo from your bedroom window, the way the light was stretching against your floorboards in lines, like quiet fingers. Neither of you named what this was becoming. You didn't ask if he was free next weekend. You didn't ask what last night had meant. You just kept the thread alive, the way some people water a plant. Not because they're gardeners, but because they can't stand and see something beautiful wilt, And with each little buzz of your phone, never rapid, never demanding, you felt your chest loosen. Just a little more. He wasn't gone. He hadn't dissolved into the what ifs of all the others before him. He hadn't let the moment vanish like steam. He had, in his own gentle way, kept whispering. And though you weren't waiting, you were listening. That night, as you brushed your teeth, you caught your reflection in the mirror, bare face, sleepy eyes, a flush in your cheeks you hadn't worn the day before. You thought of him, how he had once touched your shoulder in silence, how his voice had filled your apartment like music you didn't realize you'd missed. You didn't know what this was. You didn't need to. But for the first time in a long time, the unknown didn't feel like a cliff. It felt like a path. One you could walk barefoot. Before bed, you left your phone on the pillow beside you, not because you were hoping, but because a part of you now knew when it buzzed again, it wouldn't startle you, It would feel like a hand reaching gently in the dark. Not to take, not to pull, but simply to say, still here, still warm, still thinking about you. You didn't say his name out loud, not even to yourself. It sat somewhere behind your teeth, quiet and folded like a secret, the way a paper note might stay hidden in the corner of a worn-out coat pocket. You didn't pull it out, not yet, but you knew it was there. You felt it every time someone asked about your weekend, and you hesitated before replying with the easy kind of lie people expect. It was nice, quiet, nothing much, but your weekend hadn't been nothing, It had been heat and breath and the scent of someone who wasn't supposed to linger but had. It had been a morning that bled softly into the afternoon, a goodbye that never quite arrived. And now, 3 days later, it lived in you like static under skin. You didn't reread his messages. Not because you didn't want to, but because you knew you wouldn't stop if you did. You knew his words would come alive again, replayed with your voice in your head, and they might feel warmer than they should. And you weren't sure yet if you were allowed to be warmed by something that didn't come with promises, so you did what you always do when you're not sure. You carried on, you washed your hair, cooked dinner, walked to the grocery store and forgot what you meant to buy. You listened to the music you always listened to when your heart didn't quite know where to place itself. You smiled when your friends told stories. You laughed at the right moments, but part of you stayed curled inside that one room. That one evening, that one voice whispering across your pillow. His name didn't leave your mouth, but it sat heavy. In your pocket, every time your phone buzzed, something in you paused. You told yourself not to read into it, but your body betrayed you. How it reached before your mind caught up, how your pulse reacted first. Sometimes it was him. Sometimes it wasn't, but each time it wasn't, a small exhale left your lips, as if your lungs had forgotten not to hope. You weren't waiting. Not really. You were just Listening Dot in between the silences, you thought about texting him more than once, something light, something small. You opened the message box and let your fingers hover above the keyboard. But the words never felt right. Too soon, too much, too unsure. So you closed the app and let his name stay where it was tucked away like a ribbon in your coat pocket. Soft and slightly frayed from overdash touching Dot, the week grew colder. You started layering more scarves, boots, soft sweaters with thumb holds. You notice you walk slower now. Not out of melancholy, but because something in you was quieter, more present. Like you were listening harder to the spaces between. Things that one afternoon, a friend asked if something was different. You shook your head and smiled, brushing it off, but something was different because even when you tried not to think of him, you found yourself seeing him in the world's quieter details, the shape of a leaf stuck in a fence, a song that used the same 3 chords he'd hummed under his breath, the scent of cigarette smoke far away, not unpleasant lingering at a crosswalk. It wasn't obsession, it wasn't ache. It was something gentler, a noticing, a tenderness that stayed even in his absence. Sometimes the people who enter quietly are the ones your body memorizes the loudest. And even though he hadn't called, hadn't asked when he could see you again, you didn't fold the story closed. You kept it where you could still feel it, still remember it, like the warmth of a sweater someone else wore once and left behind, and now it smells like them, no matter how often you wash it. You didn't know what he was to you. A moment, a mistake, a maybe. You didn't try to name it. You just kept walking, kept living, kept feeling the flutter in your stomach every time a message came through. And when it wasn't him, you let the flutter settle without bitterness. You didn't beg the universe to bring him back. Just let his name sit unspoken still. Warmed out in your pocket where it had landed. And somehow that felt like enough for now. Asterisk, you never told him your middle name. Not because you were hiding it. Not because it was precious or strange or tangled in meaning, but because no one ever asked. Not really, and you never offered. It was one of those details that lived in the quiet fold of your life, like an old photograph in a drawer you hardly open, soft around the edges, unnecessary to the casual gaze, intimate in the way things are when they haven't been said aloud in years. So when he said it, that night, his voice steady, his tone gentle, like he wasn't even trying to be profound, it stopped something in you. Not everything. Not your breath, not your pulse, but some small wheel in your chest that had always turned without asking for attention that slowed. Looked up. Noticed you hadn't expected him to reach out again. Or maybe you had in that quiet back corner of the heart. Way that waits without calling itself waiting. His last message had been days ago, and the thread between you had loosened, though not snapped. It had hung there like mist, unseen but felt. And then late one evening, your phone had buzzed again. Not once, just once, enough. you around. Tonight, 3 words. Not pushy, not eager, just open. Like a window cracked just wide enough for wind to slip in. You paused. Let the moment sit in your lap for a while. Then you wrote back. Come by if you want. Doors unlocked. Candles lit. Asterisk, that was all it took. You didn't dress up. You didn't rehearse. You didn't even put away the blanket on the couch. You just sat there, curled into yourself, tea in hand, the soft scent of lavender drifting from the flame on the windowsill. And then footsteps. The door eased open, and there he was, still wearing the same kind of coat, still quiet in the way that felt like a hug without arms. He didn't rush to you, didn't kiss you immediately, just stepped in like he'd never left. And maybe in some strange slow corner of time he hadn't. You talked for a while. The kind of talking that drifts, that doesn't aim at anything. He told you about a moment in his week that made him laugh out loud in public. You told him about the bookstore you visited and how a stranger had asked for a recommendation and you'd panicked and said, The Little Prince, before realizing you hadn't read it since you were 14. He said that made sense. That you felt like someone who kept their softness hidden in stories. And you smiled because you didn't know that was something anyone else could see. You leaned into him without thinking, and his arm wrapped around your shoulder like it had been waiting there all week. You weren't lovers right now. Not exactly. You weren't friends either. You were something shapeless, something held, together by breath and timing and shared glances that lasted one beat too long. He touched your hair lightly, the way someone might touch the edge of an old map, carefully, reverently, and then, without fanfare, he said it, your middle name. He said it like he already knew it, like he wasn't guessing but remembering. You turned your head slow, met his eyes. How do you know that? He didn't grin. He didn't shrug. He just said, You said it once, half asleep, after the first night. You blinked. He continued. You rolled over and said your full name like you were correcting someone in a dream. I remembered. It shouldn't have meant anything. It was just a name, but it did. And it wasn't because the way he said it, it didn't feel like a piece of trivia. It felt like a hand on your ribs. Like someone holding a lantern inside a cave you'd forgotten was still there. You looked down then, smiled without showing your teeth. No one uses it, not even my family. I liked it, he said. It sounded like something made of satin. You felt heat in your throat, not blushing, not embarrassment. Just warmth, the kind that rises when you realize you've been seen in a way that didn't ask your permission but didn't need to. Because it wasn't invasive. It was kind. You let your head fall against his shoulder again, let your hand find his. Your fingers twined together like they had last time easy, without choreography, and for a long time you didn't speak. You just sat there, wrapped in a name no one had touched in years, held by a man who didn't try to make it more than it was, but who didn't treat it like less either. He didn't say what you meant to him, didn't ask what he was to you. But when he said your name, that name, it didn't feel like an accident. It felt like someone knocking gently on a door you'd almost forgotten how to answer, and you didn't answer with words. You just stayed right there, dot as you were dot as someone slightly more known than the hour before. Asterisk, it started small, like most real things do. A shift in tone, a longer pause between your words, not from discomfort, but from care. You were both speaking more slowly now, like you'd stopped rushing toward the exit or pretending there needed to be one. The thread had pulled taut quietly, and neither of you had dropped it. You weren't checking the time anymore when he came over. You weren't pretending to keep the lights dim because you liked the mood. It was because your body was softest in shadow now, and his voice fit better in that. Hush. You'd stopped making excuses about your hair being undone or your fridge being empty. You were just letting it be, letting him be, and he kept arriving. Not with plans, not with grand gestures, just with himself. Sometimes at 9 p.m., with 2 drinks and a tired smile. Sometimes at noon on a Sunday, with nothing but his hands in. His coat pockets and that same look like he'd been thinking about you all morning and didn't have a reason good enough to stay away. You both kept the charade going for a while, calling it timing, calling it easy, saying things like, well, you're here, so we might as well. But deep down, under your collarbone, you knew. And so did he. Coincidences don't leave toothbrushes in your bathroom drawer. They don't keep sending photos of sunlight on sidewalks with captions like, "This reminded me of your kitchen." They don't text when they're walking home alone just to ask what your night sounds like. You'd held on to the idea that this was fleeting, that he was just passing through, that this would dissolve the way it always had with others before him, like mist around a window pane the second someone exhaled. But the thing was, he wasn't dissolving. He was returning again and again, and each time softer and more real. The night it changed, really changed, was quieter than you expected. You didn't sleep together. You didn't fight. You didn't even kiss. You were just both there lying on your bed, fully dressed, feet barely touching, heads tilted back against the wall like 2 kids at a sleepover who'd grown too tired to talk. The silence had stretched long. Not awkward, just long. Then, after nearly 10 minutes of just breathing, he said, "You ever think about how this started?" You didn't answer at first. You let the memory flicker. That night outside the bar, the spark of a lighter. His voice, low, asking for your name, as if it wasn't something you were used to giving out. "I do," you said. Sometimes I wonder if I'd said no, if any of this would have happened. "You almost did," he said. You nodded. "I almost always do." He smiled, slow. "But you didn't. You stayed." And then came the shift. That quiet, almost imperceptible crumbling of whatever wall was still standing. You didn't feel like someone I needed to protect myself from. You said Dada's hand reached across the sheets then. Found yours. No urgency. Just anchoring. I didn't know what I was looking for that night, he said. But I haven't stopped thinking about you since. And there it was, the thing neither of you had said. Spoken aloud now, and somehow it didn't burst the spell. It didn't make things heavier. It made them simpler because this wasn't random. This wasn't temporary. You had already stopped pretending in 100 small ways. But now the words had caught up, and something relaxed between you both, like muscles unclenching after years of bracing. You turned your head slowly toward him, studied the line of his jaw, the softness in his eyes. He looked tired in the best way, like someone who had finally found something worth resting next to. I kept calling it nothing, you whispered. Even when I started buying the coffee you like. He let out a quiet laugh, the kind that hums against the walls. I told my friend I met someone, he said, but then I kept deleting the message before I could send it. The silence that followed was warm like an embrace neither of you had to lean into anymore because you were already inside it. You didn't ask, what are we? You didn't demand, where is this going? Instead, you just moved closer, slowly, and let your forehead rest against his chest. His breath rose to meet it. No. One said it aloud. But the pretending had ended, and neither of you missed it. Asterisk. There was something sacred about the stillness that followed. Not silence, but stillness. A kind of weightless hush that only exists between two people who have run out of things to protect. The words had already been said or didn't need to be, and now the only language left was breath. Yours, his, the spaces in between. Nothing needed fixing. Nothing begged for definition. You had reached the part of the night where everything felt earned just by staying. You lay there beside him, your head on his chest, the soft rise and fall of his breathing sinking slowly with yours. You weren't tangled, not in the way lovers. Sometimes or after passion burns bright. No, you were aligned, like two puzzle pieces not forced, just found. His arm rested across your shoulder, the curve of his palm against your skin, neither possessive nor hesitant, just there. Like it had always been. Above you, the ceiling stretched pale and still, painted in gentle shadows by the glow of your knit-stand lamp. You didn't speak. You didn't need to. The ceiling looked like a sky if you let it. Not the kind full of stars you wish upon, but the kind you lie beneath when there's nothing left to wish for, because the moment itself is enough. Every line in the plaster felt like a constellation now. The quiet hum of your heater like the wind moving softly. Between galaxies, you could feel the hours passing without urgency. Time was still here, but it had set its watch aside. There was no rush. Morning hadn't knocked. And maybe, just maybe, it never would. The world outside could wait. This room had become its own planet, a slower orbit, a gentler gravity. His fingers moved slightly, tracing small circles against your upper arm, absent-mindedly, like he was soothing a thought he wasn't ready to say aloud. You didn't ask what he was thinking. You were too afraid the answer might break the spell or, worse, define it. And some things are too soft to carry labels. You thought about how close he felt, not just in skin, in space, in the unspoken. The way you could almost feel his thoughts without him moving. The way he breathed your name once, not for attention, but as if to remind himself you were real, that you were here. You remembered the first moment, the spark from the lighter, the accidental laugh, the way he'd leaned in just a little too close when he asked if you were cold. How strange it was now to trace a line from that spark to the stillness, as if something so temporary had bloomed slowly into this tender, sprawling calm. You glanced up at him, barely moving, just your eyes. His gaze was upward too, fixed on the ceiling. You wondered what he saw there. Was he dreaming into it the same way you were? Mapping what this was, what it could be. And still, no one asked Dot, no one needed to, because here you were, not needing to be named, not needing to be held tighter or loosed away. You just were, and that somehow was more intimate than any whispered promise. You shifted slightly, curling closer. He adjusted without speaking, the warmth of his chest grounding you in a way you hadn't expected to need. I don't want to fall asleep, you murmured, finally. Why not? He said, voice low, full of drowsy silk, because I don't want to miss any of this. He turned his head, smiled into your hair. You're not missing it, he said. You're living it. You closed your eyes then, not to sleep, but to feel it better. Everything. The rhythm of him, the shape of the night. The strange, slow miracle of not needing more than this moment. Not needing him to say he'd stay. Not needing to know if he'd text tomorrow. There was peace in not asking. There was a kind of bravery in not needing an answer. So you stayed awake a little longer, not out of fear, but out of wonder, watching the ceiling as if it might reveal something about where people go when they're trying not to fall in love, but are already standing knee-deep in it. Not loudly, not all at once, just enough to forget where the edge of you ended and the edge of him began. Asterisk, you didn't expect to wake up first, but you did. And the moment your eyes fluttered open, before your mind even fully registered where you were or what time it might be, there it was, the scent of him, the ghost of his skin still woven into your pillowcase, warm, worn cotton, a trace of smoke, and something faintly sweet like bergamot or cedar or something you'd never name, but would always recognize now that it had touched you. You stayed still for a while, not out of sleepiness, but reverence. Like moving too quickly might scare the moment away. Your fingers didn't reach for your phone. Your eyes didn't dart to the clock. The only thing you did was breathe in, slow and careful, letting your lungs memorize him while the rest of you pretended it wasn't already too late for that dot. He was still beside you, of course. His chest rose and fell with the kind of calm only found after trust. His arm was tucked under the pillow, his mouth relaxed into a shape that no longer guarded words. You studied him like one studies constellations in the early morning haze, tracing familiar lines and wondering how long you'd be able to hold on to them once the light changed dot. It wasn't dramatic this morning. No rushing, no alarm clock. Slicing the silence, the world hadn't come back yet. And in that gap between night and day, you felt the strange weight of having something you didn't know how to keep. You rolled to your side, slowly letting the sheet slip a little over your bare shoulder, not to wake him, just to see him better. His eyelashes were darker here in the soft light, curled slightly like a comma at the end of a sentence you hoped wasn't finished. You wanted to tuck the blanket around his neck, kiss the slope of his cheek, say something small and unnecessary just to break the unbearable beauty of the moment, but you didn't. You let it stretch. Let it be untouched dot, and as you lay there, your senses wide open in a way you hadn't let them be in so long, you realized what was really happening. You were already remembering him, not as someone gone, but as someone impossible to forget. You were cataloging the details without meaning to. The way his fingers had curled around yours in his sleep. Even now, the way his breath occasionally caught, like he was dreaming something halfway tender. The faint indent in your sheets where his body pressed into yours. You were holding on before anything had been taken away because you didn't know what the rest of the day would be. You didn't know if he would stay for coffee or leave before the kettle even boiled. You didn't know if this would be the chapter that ends softly or continues without warning. All you knew was this. The morning smelled like him, and you weren't ready to forget that. You got up eventually, carefully, quietly, let your feet meet the cold floor with the kind of reverence reserved for walking through a room someone's still sleeping in. You padded to the kitchen, filled the kettle, took down 2 mugs without deciding if you'd need both. Your fingers moved through the ritual like memory, like habit that hadn't existed until now but already knew what to do. When the water boiled, you poured it, tea for you, coffee for him, because somehow you remembered. Somehow your body had filed him away into the part of your brain that remembers important things, like where you hid spare keys or how your grandmother used to hum while stirring soup dot, and still you didn't wake him. You just stood at the edge of the morning, sipping your tea, watching the light shift across your apartment, feeling how everything had changed and nothing looked different. When he finally stirred her, messy, eyes still heavy, that same half smile that had first cracked. Your armor, he didn't say much, just blinked, stretched one arm above his head, and whispered, "You always smell like sleep and stars." You laughed quietly, too touched to correct him. He sat up slowly. The sheets fell. The air shifted, but the spell didn't break. You handed him the mug without speaking. He took it with that grateful nod only people who shared a night like yours understand. And for a while you stood there, drinking side by side. 2 cups warming 2 sets of fingers. 2 people pretending this morning was just a morning, but feeling every inch of what it really was. You didn't ask him to stay, and he didn't say whether he would. But when he walked over and kissed your forehead, you closed your eyes and let it sink deeper than it probably should have, because this wasn't love. Not yet, but it was something scented and warm and impossibly present, not something that had tiptoed in through the smoke of a lit cigarette and now wrapped around. You like sunlight on a winter floor. The morning smelled like him, and maybe tomorrow your pillow wouldn't, but today it did. And that was enough to carry for a while. Asterisk, you didn't ask him to stay. But you didn't ask him to go either. And somewhere in that quiet space between expectation and release, he lingered. Not like a question, not like a maybe, just like someone whose feet hadn't found the door yet and whose heart hadn't asked them to. He sat with you at the little kitchen table, the one with one wobbly leg and the chipped blue mug you always meant to replace. The window let in a pale slice of light, the kind that feels more like memory than morning. It landed on his collarbone and made it look carved out of something softer than stone. He sipped his coffee in silence, and you didn't rush to fill. Some silences don't need rescuing. Some are just the room stretching around 2 people who don't want to undo anything too fast. You watched the way he looked around. Not like a guest, not like someone casing the room, but like someone trying to remember what details would matter when he closed his eyes later. The photo frame by the sink, the lavender candle burned down halfway, the tea-stained pages of the book you always left open near the couch, and the air between you full of unasked questions and soft certainties neither of you could bring yourself to name. You wanted to say something, but you didn't want to name what you had. Not because it wasn't real, but because you were afraid. Putting it into words might shrink it, and it didn't feel small, not now. Not while his bare foot rested just barely against yours beneath the table. That subtle pressure anchoring you like a lighthouse blank dot. The minutes pass like feathers, falling through honey, slow, gentle, tangible in ways time usually isn't. And he didn't reach for his coat. He didn't stand up too fast. He just stayed. You made more coffee, not because you both needed it, but because the clinking of cups, the quiet routine of hands moving, gave you something to do while your heart stood at the edge of something it didn't quite dare walk into yet. Looked up at you once, just as you were rinsing the spoon, and said, "It's warm in here." You smiled, asterisk. "It's always colder when no one's in it." He nodded. Didn't ask what you meant. Just let the word settle. like he understood they were true, even if they weren't explained. You moved back to the table, sat across from him. Again, this time your knees brushed. This time he didn't pull away. There was a part of you small, curled like the corner of an old note that wanted to ask, "What now?" But you didn't. You knew what that question really meant, and you weren't sure either of you were ready to answer it. Not out loud. Not in daylight dot, so instead you asked if you wanted toast. A small question, a safe one. He smiled. Only if you make the cinnamon kind again. You laughed. You remembered. I remember the things that taste like you, he said, not meaning it to sound as close as it did, and still he didn't leave. You buttered the bread, sprinkled cinnamon sugar with your fingers, the way your mother used to do when she was trying to make cheap breakfasts feel like treats. The kitchen filled with that sleepy, sweet scent that made the world feel like a Sunday morning that never had to end. He leaned back in his chair, watched you with soft eyes, like the kind of gaze you give to something that makes your chest ache in the nicest way. You placed the plate in front of him. He took a bite, chewed slowly, said, "This is the kind of thing that makes people stay." And for a moment you didn't move. Then finally you sat. You both ate like people who weren't starving for food. But for this rhythm, this small domestic stillness, this morning that asked nothing but your presence. And with every bite, every sip, every glance, it became more and more clear that this wasn't an accident. It had never been. After a while, you stood up and began tidying the kitchen. Not to end things, but to keep your hands busy while your thoughts settled. He joined you. Washed the cups without being asked. Dried them with the old towel you always left draped over the chair. He didn't ask where anything went. Somehow, he already knew. You caught your reflection in the window once, his silhouette beside yours, and for a second it looked like a life. Not a night, not a fling, but a life tired and quiet and strangely perfect in its smallness. And still, he didn't leave. He walked to the living room with you, sat on the couch, pulled the blanket over his lap and yours. You curled beside him without needing invitation. You both sat there for another hour, not kissing, not talking, just being, as if neither of you knew what time meant anymore, . And when he finally stood, when he finally stretched and glanced toward the door, he didn't say goodbye. He said, "I'll text you later." And for the first time since you'd met him, you believed he would. You didn't ask him to promise anything. You didn't ask when you'd see him again, but he didn't leave right away. And maybe that was the part your heart held on to most. Asterisk, you stood by the door, barefoot. The floor was cool against your heels, grounding. He had just pulled his jacket on, the same one he wore the night you met, hood tucked behind his neck, zipper half drawn, like he was still deciding how far to shield himself from the wind. And you watched him move in the slow way people do when they don't want to leave but have run out of reasons not to. His keys were already in his hand. You saw the metal glint in the early light, that quiet final shimmer that always comes with a departure. But he wasn't moving fast. He was still leaning slightly against the frame, thumb tracing the curve of your light switch, eyes wandering, as if he needed to take the shape of this room with him. You didn't speak dot not at first, because you were still listening to the way silence holds, meaning once it's been broken and rebuilt between two people who've shared too much to pretend. It was nothing. When you finally said his name, it was soft. No demand, no edge. Just his name, given back to him like a coat you'd borrowed, worn close to your skin for a while, and were now ready to return creased but cared for. He looked up, Dot eyes tired. Yes, but calm Dot, as if whatever tension had existed between you is now replaced by something else. A quieter thread, not unfinished, just unhurried. I know, he said, not answering a question, just knowing. You stepped forward then. Only once you didn't reach for him. You didn't make it more dramatic than it had to be. You just stood closer, breathing him in one more time, so close that if you'd wanted to kiss him, you could have, but you didn't. Not yet. Will you be okay? You asked, meaning it in the kind of way that included the next week, and maybe the year after that, and maybe the version of you that would still think of him when old songs came on the radio. I will, he said. Will you? You nodded, but not too quickly, because that was the truth. You would be. But you'd be a different kind of okay now, an okay with a gap in it. A light missing from the hallway, but still enough warmth in the room to not be cold. Don't know what this was, you whispered, but I don't want to erase it. His smile was the kind that pressed into the corners of your memory. You couldn't if you tried, he said. Neither could I. And that was it. He leaned down, pressed his lips to your forehead. Not your mouth, not your cheek. Your forehead. The most fragile kind of goodbye. The one that says, I know you're going to be okay. But I wanted you to feel this one last time. When he pulled back, his breath lingered a second longer than necessary. And then he stepped away. You opened the door for him, watched the way his body shifted from shadow to light in the hallway. He looked back once, just once, and then he left. But the room didn't empty, Dot, not really Dot. It still smelled like him. Like coffee and skin and something bright left on your pillow. It still held the sound of his voice saying your name like it mattered. It still carried the silence you'd both sat inside without. Needing to fix it, you didn't cry. Not right then. You sat on the couch, pulled the blanket over your legs, and listened to the faint hum of the world starting up again outside. Birdsong. Car door. Someone's dog barking far away. You looked at the mug he used, still resting on the windowsill. You didn't move it. You let it stay. Just for a while longer, not because you couldn't let go, but because some things deserve to linger before they fade. You thought about how you'd looked that first night, how his hand had lit your cigarette. without asking how his voice had carved its way into your chest without pushing. You thought about how the story hadn't needed to last forever to matter. How this tangled, quiet, beautiful pause in your life was enough to feel real enough to be remembered. And as the morning sunlight warmed your feet and the street filled with the life you hadn't thought about for hours, you smiled to yourself because this goodbye didn't feel like an ending dot. It felt like a full stop, breath, a moment of punctuation before the next sentence begins. And maybe someday you'll light another cigarette, and maybe without meaning to, you'll look up into the soft wind of a night you weren't expecting. And remember the way it felt when someone lit a spark in you. Not loudly dot, not forever, just enough dot to make you feel alive again. Asterisk, some nights arrive like accidents, but this one arrived like a song you almost forgot you loved, playing quietly in the background of your own life. He lit my cigarette, but that wasn't the spark that changed everything. What changed me was the quiet between the laughter, the way he looked at me like he'd heard my story before I told it. The goodbye that didn't feel like goodbye, and the silence that stayed long after he left, full of warmth, full of memory, full of the kind of softness that can only exist when you've let someone in, even just for a little while. Sometimes a night isn't meant to last. It's meant to be lived and remembered, and then released like smoke curling into the dark sky, making room for whatever comes next.